In his works, the Gothic writer accurately predicted catastrophes that occurred many years after publication. Edgar Allan Poe was born in America in a family of actors, but very early became an orphan. His father left the family when Edgar was still a baby, and his mother soon died of consumption. The boy was lucky; he was adopted by a wealthy family, thanks to which the future writer received a good education and acquired manners. Years of study revealed in him a talent for writing and a passion for poetry, which formed the basis of his work. Indeed, Edgar gained his fame primarily as a poet and author of short prose. He was loved for such works as The Fall of the House of Usher, The Tell-Tale Heart, The Red Death Mask, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Stolen Letter. However, the writer also has things that are not so popular. They are not so interesting to the general reader and literary critic, but they will impress a lover of mysticism. Indeed, in some of them you can find real prophecies. The novel Arthur Gordon Pym's Tale of Nantucket, to put it mildly, was not liked by Poe's contemporaries. More precisely, he was condemned for violent scenes, eerie details and factual inaccuracies in the description of sea adventures. The heroes of the work talk about the troubles they once got into when they went to the open sea in a small boat. Men in distress miraculously end up on the Grampus whaling ship and seem to find themselves in a horror movie. Edgar Allan Poe described shipwrecks, sea monsters, ghost ships and dangerous natives, all in his characteristic dark colors. One of the most terrible scenes was the description of the days spent by the heroes in the boat without food and water supplies. Several people had only the remains of a sea turtle at their disposal, so young people pulled out a straw, choosing a victim to be torn to pieces. She became a hero named Richard Parker, whose remains were thrown overboard by the passengers of the ill-fated boat. Half a century later, all the English newspapers are discussing the wreck of the Mignonette yacht, which sank somewhere on the way to Australia. The ship was not intended for such distant voyages. There were 4 people on the Mignonette: Thomas Dudley, Edward Brooks, Edwin Stevens, and Richard Parker. They ended up in a lifeboat and suffered for several days from the scorching sun and thirst until they caught a sea turtle. But even this was not enough. One of the young men took a sip of seawater and became very poisoned. 3 fellow travelers killed him, realizing that the poor fellow was already doomed. The victim was none other than Richard Parker, the full namesake of the hero of Arthur Gordon Pym's Nantucket Tale. 100 years passed before his distant relative read Edgar Poe's novel and discovered an incredible number of coincidences, not only the name, but also the age of the hero, and many other details of his death. Could the circumstance become a copy of fiction? The mystery has remained unsolved. In the short story The Dealer, 1840, Edgar Poe's hero suffers from a severe head injury. He is overcome by severe seizures that change his behavior and make him a monster. The author described in detail exactly how the hero behaves, and, without knowing it, exactly listed the symptoms of the frontal lobe syndrome. A similar case in real life happened only 8 years later. In 1848, the railway worker Phineas Gage miraculously survives after like a metal bar going through his head. Bypassing death, he, unfortunately, becomes a maniac, unable to control his behavior. This case was studied by doctors, discovering many patterns of the frontal lobe of the brain and understanding what role it plays in the development of cognitive abilities. The famous neurologist Eric Altschuler was amazed when he read The Dealer and compared the author's descriptions with real practice. There are dozens of symptoms, and Poe knew every one of them. This story describes everything. We are unlikely to learn anything else. Everything is so accurate that it's just strange, as if he had a time machine. He shared his impressions. In 1848, Poe completes an essay dedicated to the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, which he himself calls a prose poem. Eureka, or An Essay on the Material and Spiritual Universe, tells about the relationship between God and man, the universe and the emergence of nature. According to Poe himself, he experienced a tremendous insight that he wanted to put on paper. Having expressed his intuitive understanding of the world order, the writer turned out to be close to the results of studies on the origin of the universe, which were carried out 80 years after the publication of Eureka. Thus, he tells how the universe appeared from one small particle, about the Big Bang, and began its dynamic development, expanding more and more in space. Later, scientists will discover that Poe even described Olber's paradox, suggesting why the sky remains dark when the stars shine on it. And this despite the fact that the author's contemporaries were sure that the universe is absolutely static, and the work of Edgar Allan Poe is illogical, too complicated, and generally ridiculous. The fact that he had a mystical gift will be understood only when the appropriate technical equipment is invented, but this will take almost 100 years.